Well, housing affordability is now at its worst level.
Saving the great Australian dream.
Housing affordability has hit a 3-decade low.
There's no doubt that the headlines are painting a grim picture of home ownership for many Australians.
According to the report, it's also taking longer for Australians to save for a deposit, with a typical household needing to save 20% of their income.
But are these headlines being overly dramatic? Is the housing crisis really the worst it's been in 3 decades? Or is it time to face the music? Is the Australian dream of home ownership dead? Buying a home has become unattainable for a lot of everyday Australians, and many have given up. In fact, the census data spells it out. In 1971, 68% of those aged 30 to 34 owned their home. By 2021, that figure fell to just under 50%. And for 35 to 39-year-olds, rates have dropped from over 70% to 59% in the same period. But for people who do have their foot in the door already, they're sitting pretty. Since the 1990s, house prices have nearly quadrupled, defying downturns and political shifts. Compare that to the more gradual post-war rise from the 1960s onwards. So, how did we get here? Why are so many Australians locked out of the property market while others thrive? What does the housing crisis actually mean? And where does that leave aspiring homeowners today? Well, the best way to explain it is by looking at economic tools and in particular, the underlying drivers of demand and supply. Now, there are several common themes that create a mismatch between demand and supply in the property market. And this mismatch is ultimately keeping prices elevated and making it difficult for prospective buyers, especially first home buyers, to get into the market. It's so severe that Housing Australia estimated a shortage of 106,300 homes between 2023 and 2027. And after analysing the latest migration figures, the Institute of Public Affairs expects the shortfall to be even worse at 252,800 dwellings, which would cost on average $24 billion per year to construct. But the question still begs, why? Why are we in this position today? I have sifted through literally hundreds of pages of data and economic opinions on this supply and demand issue and essentially developed an 8-part framework to help get you the answers you need. Let's start with part 1, low interest rates. Low interest rates, or cheap money, have been the common scapegoat for why Australian property prices are so high. And looking at recent history, it's easy to see why.
Home loan lending is on the rise thanks to low interest rates and improved confidence in the property market.
It's the third rate cut in just 5 months. The RBA lowered rates in June and then again in July. Today's cut is the first time the official rate has ever fallen below 1%.
Between 2008 and 2022, Australia was in a period of loose monetary policy, which means rates were either on the decline or left on hold for months on end. Between September 2008 and September 2009, against the backdrop of the global financial crisis, the RBA lowered the cash rate from 7.25% to 3%. And then, the cash rate remained at 4.75% for most of 2011 before it was lowered to the historic low of 0.1% at the height of the pandemic. During the same period, the property market soared to more than double in value. If we just look at the figures during the pandemic period, they tell their own story. Interest rates were at a never-seen-before 0.1%. And property values were nearly 25% higher than they were before March 2020. But while most blame the RBA and low interest rates, they don't actually paint the full picture. In fact, if we look at property trends between the 1980s and 1990s, interest rates were on the rise, but property prices remained resilient. And if we look at the current property trends around the world, many countries also experienced low interest rates, but their house prices haven't risen at the same pace as Australia. And here's the thing, Central banks, including the RBA, don't really care about property prices. It's not a central bank's role to target asset prices. They're actually only concerned to the extent that price rises impact feelings of wealth and therefore household consumption, which is a direct driver of GDP. Dr. Philip Lowe said it best in his closing remarks as the outgoing RBA governor.
Interest rates influencing housing prices, but they are not the reason that Australia has some of the highest cost of housing in the world.
So, if interest rates aren't the only thing to blame, then what else is pushing property prices up? To unpack this, we need to jump to the supply side of the equation, because this side of the fence is where you'll find most of the issues impacting Australia's housing crisis. And here's the thing, yes, Australia has an abundance of resource-rich land, but we have a stark shortage of well-located land. In other words, the land located where we all want to live, near services, infrastructure, communities, amenities, and most importantly, jobs, is in very short supply. Let me put it in this way. Over 50% of Australia's population live in its three major cities, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. If we compare this to the UK, where 50% of its population is spread across 9 of its largest cities, or the USA, where half the population live across 36 cities, it's really unusual. Part of the problem also lies in the fact that our cities have so many geographical constraints. Sydney is a prime example of this. It's landlocked between its eastern side by harbours, bays and beaches, and its western side by the Blue Mountains. Another factor which forms part 3 of our framework that's linked to the shortage of well-located land is our cultural demand for space and lifestyle. We have a general tendency to resist vertical living within the city centre, with many preferring the lifestyle of middle ring and outer suburbs. This has led to an aversion towards high-density living, which means cities are much more spread out compared to our overseas counterparts. And of course, without more density and only so much livable land, we drive demand up along with property prices. What also happens is that the land component becomes the most valuable part of a property. You can see this by looking at the massive difference in the increase in prices between houses versus units. Over a 30-year period, house values in Australia's capital cities have increased 4.5 times to nearly $930,000, while unit values have only tripled to just over $635,000. And I'm sure it comes at no surprise that the growth in land value has far exceeded the growth in incomes. It takes about 10 years to save up a 20% deposit, whereas in 2001, it would have taken you around 6 years. And if I add another layer to this, and look at the stats in relation to the higher interest rates, the national estimate of median income required to service a new mortgage is now at a record high of 45.5% of income, compared to an average of 34.5% in 2010. So no, you're not just imagining it. It is definitely more expensive to buy a house today than it was 10 to 20 years ago. But the harsh reality of it is that high property prices are also a result of the choices we make as a society. Our government, which we vote in, have all made certain choices that have led to higher land and housing costs. I'll touch on taxes soon, but one of the loudest complaints at the moment, and part 4 of our supply and demand framework, is that new land releases are just too slow. Although $37 billion worth of new land was released across Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria in 2023's financial year, demand is still far overtaking supply. Settlements on new residential land have dipped 13.6% to almost 74,000 dwellings this financial year, with average time to settle vacant land taking on average 275 days in New South Wales and over a year in Victoria. It doesn't help that new land releases sell like hotcakes because families and first home buyers find it more attractive to build and customize their own home rather than buying an established inner city home or apartment. In the 3 LGAs of Camden, Blacktown City and Liverpool City alone, a shortage of 4,276 dwellings are forecasted over the next 5 financial years, despite significant new land releases. But the issues don't stop there. To add even more fuel to the fire, planning approvals for high density and medium density developments at a local government level are heavily bottlenecked and painfully slow. The reason? NIMBY resistance. Local and established property owners frequently resist and oppose new planning approvals by effectively saying, "Not in my backyard." In fact, approval rates have dropped nearly 35% over the last year and over 50% over the last decade. So basically, those with property are keeping others out of the market, essentially keeping demand and consequently prices high. Now, pursuing space and protecting space is one thing, but it's still not enough to explain all the weight of demand in the Australian property market. So, where is the surplus demand coming from? Well, another huge demand driver is immigration. A key contributor towards economic growth in Australia has come from immigration. It is pretty hard to argue otherwise. But the question is, what is a level that is sustainable? From a numbers perspective, before the pandemic, the government was maintaining a level of immigration equating to roughly 220,000 people each year. Things obviously took a turn during the pandemic thanks to border closures. This meant that only 6,866 immigrants were reported arriving by December 2021. So since last year, the government has been playing catch-up and tweaking policies to allow for 195,000 migrants between 2022 and 2023 and a forecasted 190,000 migrants over the next 3 years. But here's the thing though, over 400,000 migrants arrived in 2022 alone. Many of these new arrivals were students, with ABS figures showing over 250,000 students arriving by the end of financial year 2023. This is the largest student intake on record and equivalent to over 101,000 new households forming. And certain interest groups aren't holding back on their criticism. They've argued that a large portion of student housing demand is unaccounted for, and Australia's stock of housing simply won't be able to cope. It's estimated that 70% of new housing units supplied to the market over the last financial year were taken up by international students, leaving only 30% for the rest of the country, including other new migrants. This has put an enormous amount of pressure on the availability of rental accommodation, rapidly forcing rental costs to surge, which also spills over to demand for buying. So, ultimately, while sustainable immigration is healthy for economic growth, many have criticized the government for allowing higher levels of immigration compared to what was originally forecasted pre-pandemic.
This is another example where government policy or governments in their policy didn't look forward as to the results of the outcomes.
Now, I mentioned taxes earlier. Many argue that reforming taxes such as negative gearing, capital gains tax, stamp duty, and land tax could dramatically assist with housing affordability. However, messing around with our established tax frameworks is not a popular move for politicians. This is a big topic in itself, so I'm going to keep this brief. Let's focus on negative gearing, which is a hot topic when talking property taxes. Negative gearing reduces the holding costs of investors who borrow to invest and arguably boosts demand for investment properties. But the question is, will reforming this tax lower property prices, and if so, by how much? Research by the Grattan Institute has shown that limiting passive investment losses so that they can't be written off against wage income would lower property prices by up to 2%. I won't judge whether 2% is big or small, but the impact is nowhere near the level put forward by commentators. Now, Moving the discussion back to the supply side of the equation, they say time is money, and nowhere is this more true than the property development world, where each day of project delay can mean thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in extra costs. Even if more land can be supplied or projects approved, the viability of builders and developers form a critical part of the value chain to ensure completed properties get delivered on time. But more recently, supply from builders and developers have been impacted by a perfect storm of cost-related issues. Literally. In 2022, inclement weather caused 20,000 detached dwellings and 8,000 multi-density dwellings to be delayed. Supply chain shocks have caused the price of key building materials and construction inputs to rise by up to 30% for some inputs. And labour shortages have also dramatically increased construction costs. Since 2021, builders are paying 3 times more to hire a steel worker and 50% more to hire a form worker. So, supply has taken a serious hit, with expected building completions down almost 30,000 for detached dwellings and over 15,000 for multi-density dwellings in the last year compared to forecasts. It also meant that quite a few high-profile builders like Porter Davis and Chatham Homes have gone bust because they couldn't honour their fixed-price building contracts. In addition to rising construction costs, high interest rates further throw out the feasibility of new developments, which brings me to the last part of our framework. We started with low interest rates, and now we're ending with high interest rates. Because at the end of the day, it's all a cycle. As you well know, we've recently seen the steepest increase on interest rates over the last 20 years, and this impacts everyone, from big-time property developers to first-time homebuyers. Many new developments have become unprofitable, making it less likely to ever get off the ground. Existing projects are experiencing higher holding costs, meaning they erode the developer's liquidity, threatening their viability and increasing the chances that they could go under. And at a household level, high interest rates are meant to increase the supply of housing stock as more people are forced to sell, which contributes to falling house prices. But this hasn't happened for 3 reasons. Number 1, a large stock of fixed-rate mortgages secured at really low interest rates during the pandemic have delayed the impact of rising mortgage repayments and falling prices. Number 2, borrowing capacities have fallen by more than the reduction in property prices. So basically, the same income gets you less property than before interest rates started to rise. And number 3, even with lower house prices, deposit requirements still prove difficult at current income levels relative to property values. And that brings us to the end of this video. I know this has been a very deep, multi-dimensional topic and a lot to take in. So if you've gotten this far, thank you for following along the way. There's going to be a second part to this video where I'll assess the impact of the housing crisis on Australian households and what you can do about it. But until then, I think the best way to wrap up everything I've covered is to circle back to something Dr. Philip Lowe said before his departure.
But the reason that Australia has some of the highest housing prices in the world isn't interest rates, which have been roughly at similar levels in other countries with quite different levels of housing prices. The high housing prices are the outcomes of the choices that we've all made together as a society. Choices about where we live, how we design our cities, and how we design and regulate urban land, how we invest in and design transport systems, and how we tax land and how we tax housing investment. In each of these areas, our society and our politicians have made choices that lead to high urban land and high urban housing costs. It's by tackling these issues that we can address the high cost of housing in Australia, which personally I view as a serious economic and social problem.
Thank you for watching, and if you learned something today, please subscribe to the SF Capital YouTube channel and share this video with your friends, family and colleagues. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.